Robert Michael Gates was born in Wichita, Kansas. He has been a lifelong member of the Boy Scouts of America and recipient of the Scouts' highest honor as an adult. He graduated from the College of William and Mary with an undergraduate degree in history and obtained his master's degree from Indiana University and his Ph.D. from Georgetown. Mr. Gates was recruited by the Central Intelligence Agency when he was a student at Indiana University. Under the CIA, he was trained and became a second lieutenant in the U.S. Air Force and was assigned to the Strategic Air Command as an intelligence officer. Once his Air Force service concluded, he worked for the CIA as an analyst. From 1974 to 79, Gates joined the National Security Council, and following that, he returned to the CIA to work as director for the Strategic Evaluation Center Office of Strategic Research. Gates' meteoric rise in the CIA was quick and unprecedented owing to his nonpartisan analysis, direct style, and leadership skills. He was named director of the DCI-DDCI executive staff, followed by deputy director for intelligence, followed by deputy director for Central Intelligence Agency. Wow, that's a mouthful. Mr. Gates retired from the CIA in 1993 to lecture and become the president of Texas A&M. But Washington was far from done with Gates, though he declined the opportunity to become the Director of National Intelligence and other pleas to return to office. In 2006, the call to duty was too great, and he accepted and was unanimously confirmed as Secretary of Defense in the Bush administration. And when President Barack Obama took office, he was quick to announce that Secretary Gates would again be called to service. Gates remains the only Secretary of Defense in our nation's history to serve two contiguous administrations. Under Obama, Gates oversaw the withdrawal of troops from Iraq, troop surge in Afghanistan, and was the leading proponent of shifting the military budget toward 21st century weaponry. He was also one of the leaders photographed in the Situation Room when Osama bin Laden was brought to justice. It's my pleasure to welcome to the Costa Report former Secretary of Defense and Director of the CIA, Mr. Robert Gates. Thank you for joining us today, Mr. Gates.
It's my pleasure.
Well, there were certainly a lot of nervous Nellies in Washington prior to the release of your book, Duty, Memoirs of a Secretary at War. And most of the hubbub seemed to center around the fact that you chose to speak about your experience with a president, cabinet, and Congress that is still currently in office. So let me ask you about that first. Was there any reason to wait?
Well, I thought that a lot of the problems that I write about in the book, whether it's getting the defense budget under control, decisions in terms of how to deal with China, how to deal with Russia, relationships between the executive branch and the Congress, the need for reform in the way the Congress deals with defense issues, the need for reform inside the Department of Defense. It seemed to me that all of these things were contemporary problems, and it didn't make any sense at all to wait until 2017 to write about them.
It took a great deal of courage, I think, not to wait, but it's also consistent with your philosophy of duty and being of service to the nation. Now, I host a nonpartisan program, and I tell our listeners that I'm an independent precisely because I see equal room for improvement on both sides of the aisle. And so your book served to reinforce my belief that we don't seem to have leaders or systems in place which put what is good for the country and the planet ahead of all else. So when the only Secretary of Defense to serve two administrations in a row and to have served, 6 presidents, says the bureaucracy and gridlock is intolerable and is destroying us, don't you run the risk of alienating both sides of the aisle in one full blow?
Well, to tell you the truth, I don't think it takes much courage to write such a book if you have no desire ever to go back to Washington, D.C. again.
Well, there you go. You had nothing to lose.
Well, and I think it's important to sort of lay bare the impact on our military and of our men and women in uniform and of our ability even to conduct defense policy, much less a war or two wars, given the partisan divide in Congress and the polarization that has led significantly to paralysis. Just as an example, between 2007 and 2011, I submitted 5 defense budgets to the Congress, and not once did I get an appropriations bill out of Congress before the start of a new fiscal year. So, and oftentimes my budget would be released to me a couple of months at a time in terms of funding the wars and so on. And it's for people who want to see a more efficient and more cost-effective Department of Defense, that certainly doesn't help when you get right down to it.
Now, did you ever get to the bottom of that? Did you ever get an explanation on why you just couldn't have a full budget before we entered war?
Oh, it was just the partisan divide, and particularly on the war in Iraq in 2007. The partisan divide between the Republicans and the Democrats was just so deep, and the defense budget was a weapon in that war. And one of the reasons why we kept getting delays in the funding was because the Democrats wanted to use the budget to force the president to change his policies in Iraq, and the president wasn't about to change his policies in Iraq, change the surge or draw it down before it had hardly even gotten there. And the result was gridlock up on the Hill. So, but it comes to more basic things, and we've seen it just in the last couple of weeks. I mean, here the Department of Defense put forward some pretty sensible reforms and changes in terms of cutting overhead, getting rid of outdated weapons systems, closing some facilities, and so on. And the Congress rejected them all, and wants to pretend that they can cut the defense budget while not allowing the Defense Department to make the kind of sensible cuts that will protect our military capabilities. So it's that kind of parochialism. It's not just partisanship, it's parochialism. No member of Congress, well, let me put it another way, every member of Congress is in favor of cutting the defense budget, just not any program or contract in his district or state.
Well, and you do make a serious point of the fact that when it came to protecting budgets for their individual programs in individual states, people would fight to the death for it. But one of the most startling points that you make in your book is that you did not seek out this job, Secretary of Defense, nor did you necessarily want it or enjoy it. In fact, this was a very difficult assignment for you, and you struggled with making decisions to send men and women into harm's way. And at the same time, you were working with leaders who seemed unable to make any connection between the decisions, budgetary or otherwise, they were making and the fact that fathers and mothers and sons and daughters were going to die because of those decisions.
Well, I think a good example of this occurred in March of 2011 when I asked our Appropriations and Armed Services Committees to approve a transfer of money from building more Humvees, the Jeep-like vehicles for the Army, which the Army didn't want any more of, in order to pay for additional intelligence and reconnaissance capabilities that the commanders in Afghanistan had requested. Mm-hmm. And the one committee of Congress blocked it. It turned out the committee chairman had received $80,000 in campaign contributions from the maker of the Humvee. So
well, now we're going to get into that a little deeper in the next segment, but we have to take a scheduled break here. But stay right where you are. We'll be right back with more from Secretary Robert Gates. You're listening to the Costa Report.
Did you know that every day we create 2.5 quintillion bytes of data, and that 90% of the data in the world today has been created in the last 2 years alone? This data comes from everywhere, and it affects everyone. This data is big data. Big data is all data, and it's more than simply a matter of size. Big data represents an opportunity to uncover new insights, make your business more agile, and answer questions that were previously beyond your reach. IBM's Big Data platform uses sophisticated technologies and patented advanced analytics designed to complement your existing information infrastructure. The IBM Big Data platform allows you to get started quickly today and expand to address more complex problems tomorrow. It doesn't matter where you start, it matters that you start. Find out how IBM can help you turn big data into a competitive advantage by visiting ibm.com/big data today.
Every day our world gets more complicated. Not only is new information coming at us faster than we can manage, new regulations, technology, and the effects of globalization have made it much more difficult to succeed. That's why I wrote The Watchman's Rattle, a book that, for the first time, explains how complexity makes it hard to separate facts from fiction, and eventually causes us to make important decisions based on unproven beliefs. And not just us, our leaders also fall prey to this phenomena. But here's the good news. Once you know the symptoms to watch for, you can safeguard against them. So please, go to RebeccaCosta.com. That's RebeccaCosta.com and order your copy of The Watchman's Rattle. It only takes a few minutes and the shipping is free. That's RebeccaCosta.com. Do it now. You'll be glad you did.
Greetings, folks. This is Randy the Realtor. You may have heard my ads before on this station, and I'm here to tell you that MZ is right. He doesn't let stupid people listen to his radio station. Everyone who called me because they heard my radio spots have been very intelligent and wonderful people that I was glad to even have had a conversation with. A couple of my most recent contacts are Louis and Susan. They recently opened an antique clock shop in Aptos on the corner of Trout Gulch and Soquel Drive. Go by and visit them. If you need a nice antique clock or need one repaired, stop in and see them. If you need to buy or sell a home, give me a call. I'll make your transaction run like clockwork. Call Randy the Realtor at 831-566-2590. That's 831-566-2590. Or visit my website at aptoshomefinder.com.
Shirt Crafter, your one-stop print shop, has been locally owned and operated in Santa Cruz for a decade, providing custom design services to help you build your brand. Shirt Crafter provides top-of-the-line custom screen printing, digital printing, embroidery, stickers, banners, business cards, and so much more. They carry top-quality brands of gear from T-shirts and polos to sweatshirts and ball caps. Whether you're outfitting your softball team or team building for your business, Shirt Crafter has it all. So build your brand with Shirt Crafter, located at 111 Ingle Street in Santa Cruz, or go to www.shirtcrafter.com. Or you could give them a call at 831-423-0537. That's Shirt Crafter, 831-423-0537.
Welcome back to the Costa Report. I'm Rebecca Costa, and my guest today is former Secretary of Defense, Mr. Robert Gates. And before the break, we were talking about the fact that you were making requests for additional budgets for military intelligence and Humvees and other things that would protect our soldiers, and getting turned down because certain leaders had received campaign contributions from companies whose interests were not served by some of your requests. So here you are. On the one hand, ordering soldiers to put their life on the line, and on the other hand, in your book, you're listening to President Obama say that he does not trust his generals, and you have Harry Reid ask you to include a study on irritable bowel syndrome in the defense budget. It must have felt surreal.
Well, welcome to Washington. There is a certain surreal aspect to it, but that's our system of government, and I always like to tell people, one of the objectives of the founders was not to make government efficient; it was to protect liberty, and so they created a system that, frankly, depends on compromise to work, and I think one of the things that has declined in recent years. I actually worked for 8 presidents, so I started under Lyndon Johnson, and we've always had partisan politics, and our politics have always been ugly. But at the end of the day, there have been enough people on the Hill that have been willing to make compromises to move the public's business forward. And that's what this willingness to compromise is what has declined in recent years, and to the point where compromise means selling out. And people seem to need to go back to seventh grade history and study the Constitution to realize that without compromise, we do end up with paralysis. And in some ways, maybe that's a good thing in terms of limiting the power of government. But on the other, there is the people's business that needs to be done, whether it's defense or air traffic control or the national parks or 100 other things, and not being able to get those things funded, not to be able to address some of our more far-reaching problems, I think is a real problem for the country. And my own view is that part of the problem is that too many members of Congress, contrary to the expectations of the Founding Fathers, have become careerists. They're not people who were successful in private life or as lawyers or farmers or business people or doctors or anybody like that. They're basically career politicians, and once they get into Congress, their primary objective is to stay there. And so re-election is the first priority for them, and anything that gets in the way of that is something that they're going to oppose. And I think that has contributed to the kind of both the polarization and the paralysis that we see.
Well, I can't think of anything worse than paralysis when it comes to decisions affecting our military or our security. I mean, paralysis and gridlock can't be good. Some of these decisions, they have to be made in very short order. And I think you greatly diminish the effectiveness of generals and the Secretary of Defense, all branches of security for the nation. If they don't have clear budgets, they don't have clear authority, and they certainly don't have the trust of the president.
Well, I think that the with respect to the latter, it really was, I think, a matter of President Obama being suspicious that the generals were trying to box him in on troop increases in Afghanistan. That was the primary area where I saw it, and I did my best to try and persuade him that they were just making, agree with them or not, they were making honest recommendations, and that there was no conspiracy to try and back him into a corner. But as I write in the book, frankly, I didn't have much luck in assuaging his concerns. And as I write, there were some things said and done by some senior military officers that I think contributed to his suspicion of them going out and saying things in public that if you were sitting in the White House looked an awful lot like you were trying to put pressure on the President of the United States to make a decision one way or the other. So this wasn't entirely a one-way street, but it did contribute to suspicion on the part of the President as to their motives and their recommendations. I will say this, both President Bush and President Obama, like many of their predecessors as president, were willing to overrule the military when they thought the military was wrong. And frankly, that's what civilian control of our military is all about. And in virtually every case, I supported the president because I thought he was right.
Well, we've had this, I'm a great student of history, and we've had this before. At one point, Eisenhower was very concerned with the recommendations on nuclear weaponry from his military. But, rather than think that they were conspiring in some way, which they certainly weren't, he brought in specialists in nuclear weaponry and in physics, basically, to come into the White House and discuss and educate him so that he could make better decisions. But I don't think it ever amounted to conspiracy. Could you tell the story? We've got a few minutes here before we have to go to break. Could you tell the story of going to Nancy Pelosi to talk about ground conditions in Iraq? Because I think our audience would like to hear about that.
Well, I basically, after the surge had been underway, it seemed to me, and I think to almost everyone, that in fact that the surge had worked, that security had returned to broad stretches of Iraq, that stability had been restored to the country. It wasn't perfect by any means, but there had been dramatic progress, and then somewhat the president went ahead and he announced a timetable for withdrawal. He announced that troops would begin to be withdrawn, and on what kind of a schedule, and at what point our participation in Iraq would end. And I went to the Speaker and Speaker Pelosi, and I said, look, the president has essentially done what you all have been asking him to do for a couple of years. He's set a timetable for withdrawal. He's set the circumstances for that, and he has essentially agreed to do most of the things that you all have been asking him to do. And so this is an opportunity for bipartisan support to see if we can end this on a different in this war on a different and better note here at home than has been the case since 2003. And she wasn't interested. She was very partisan about the war, and no matter what happened on the ground, she was not prepared to concede that anything positive had happened in Iraq. And I understand the strong feelings about that, and it had been a very partisan issue on the Hill, and had become even more so. But she and I actually had a pretty good relationship, and she would often invite me to breakfast on the Hill, and often just two of us. And we always had a very civil relationship, but on this particular issue where I tried to put forward a bipartisan approach trying to end this war, she wasn't interested.
Well, this definitely comes across in your book that you wanted to provide a balanced perspective on the war, and there was no takers for that, and that's unfortunate. Now, we have to take another short break. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about trust and duty. You're listening to the Costa Report. Now, if you've been listening to the Costa Report, you know that I'm a big fan of wines by Caraccioli Cellars, and today I'm here with Scott Caraccioli, who's one of the brains behind the most memorable wines money can buy. So I have a question for you. How did your family get into the wine business?
2006, my father, his brother, and uncle were really playing with the idea of planting a vineyard, and planting a vineyard turned into making a bottle, turned into making sparkling wine when Michelle came into the picture. So it was really kind of an organic situation, us being in agriculture in the Salinas Valley, and then the extension of that went to grapes, and here we are today. To find out more about Caraccioli wines, visit us at www.caracciolicellars.com or stop by our tasting room in downtown Carmel, California. That's Caraccioli Cellars, Caraccioli, Cellars, where one bottle is never enough.
As with so many things you hear, there's another side to the story. Like Marshall Tuck's campaign for Superintendent of Public Instruction. Here's the big problem. Records prove that after a year of running the Partnership for LA Schools, Marshall Tuck was hit with a resounding vote of no confidence from teachers in 8 of his 10 schools. No confidence is Tuck's real record in education.
That's why Californians can be confident with former teacher Tom Torlakson as our superintendent. Torlakson's working to guarantee spending decisions about our education tax dollars are made by the local community and not by Sacramento politicians. The same Tom Torlakson who passed the Career Readiness Initiative, helping schools expand job and technical training, because Tom Torlakson knows a well-rounded education is the best way to keep California public schools moving forward.
Paid for by Torlakson for Superintendent of Public Instruction 2014. Major funding by California Teachers Association, Independent Expenditure Committee, and California State Council of Service Employees Political Committee. Not authorized by a candidate or candidates committee.
Hi, everyone. This is Kay Swirling. MZ and I are quite proud of the station you're listening to. Quite frequently, I meet people who express their appreciation for KSCO, one of the few remaining independent, locally owned radio voices left in our country. Of course, this is gratifying, but it's very important that you understand and keep in mind that KSCO is made possible by 3 things: advertising sales, book, hat, bag, and other KSCO gear sales, and in particular, longevity health product sales. You see, every time somebody in our audience purchases longevity products such as Beyond Tangy Tangerine or the Healthy Start Pack, that person is directly supporting our operation and making it possible for us to continue to serve our community. We feel good about recommending these products because they are of the highest quality and they do work. I know, because I take these products every day and I can enthusiastically vouch for their goodness and effectiveness. I first heard Dr. Wallach's message about taking charge of your health through nutrition nearly 20 years ago. I strongly believe in nutritional supplementation over toxic prescription drugs and invite you to help yourself and help KSCO and KOMY by trying and using these products as I do. Visit kscoteam.com or kscohealth.com or call one of your local longevity distributors. For KSCO and KOMY, this is Kay Swirling.
Welcome back to the Costa Report. I'm Rebecca Costa, and today we're speaking with former Secretary of Defense, Mr. Robert Gates. And earlier you were pointing out that, in your view, the defense of the country is not a partisan issue, and part of your responsibility was to present a balanced view on ground conditions and what had been achieved, and also what was needed to further succeed. But in addition to partisan leadership, you also point to the fact that the Pentagon has become so bureaucratic and so burdened with procedures and regulations that it's hard to be as responsive as they need to be. Is that right?
Well, it's right, and a big part of it is the Pentagon's own fault, and the failure to bring about institutional reform. But a part of it also is the micromanagement by the Congress. So the defense authorization bill each year, which authorizes various activities by the Department of Defense, is about 1,000 pages long, and for the most part, it's 1,000 pages of requesting reports, of limiting certain kinds of activities, of regulating other kinds of activities, and it's important to understand these are also cumulative. So every year there's another 1,000 pages of micromanagement and telling the Department of Defense how to do its business. And, of course, it reflects the interests of every member of the Armed Services Committees. And so that, let's just say that doesn't make the job of trying to reform the Pentagon any easier.
Well, this is just a thicket of complexity that grows worse with every single year. And it's such a systemic problem. I mean, it even goes so far as to explain what happened in Benghazi. I mean, I know somebody wants to pin it on some leader, but having been in Washington and worked in Washington for a while, I have to say that there are other explanations for Benghazi that have to do with systemic overwhelm, if you will.
Well, let me be clear. One of the reasons I wrote the book is because everybody and I earlier in this interview talked about the paralysis in Washington, but the reality is I made it work. In 2009, I cut nearly 36 major defense programs. Had they been built to completion, it would have cost the taxpayers about $330 billion.
Yes, you did.
Overcost, overdue, and had obsolete technologies, or there was no longer a requirement. And then in 2010, I cut $180 billion in overhead over the ensuing 10 years. So you can do these things. And I, on the cuts of those programs, by the way I did it and with the support of the president, we got the Congress to acquiesce in or support every single one of those. None of my predecessors had been able to do that. So if you have the right approach, if you have a strong partnership with the president, he's willing to wield the veto, and you have some allies on Capitol Hill, you can make these things work. And that's one of the important reasons I wrote the book, was to show that if you have the right skill set and if you have the right support, you can reform these bureaucracies and make them do better and save money for the taxpayers.
But you need to have leaders who are willing to put duty above all things.
Well, that's absolutely right.
And if you don't have people that are working for the greater good, but instead are working for other agendas, which you this book, I tell you, my neck is hurting from shaking my head as I read this book. I just kept shaking my head and saying, this can't be right. And of course it's right. But, I wanted this to, I would have felt better if you had put this in the fiction section of the bookstore. Very disturbing and confirming what a lot of Americans think, but don't have anybody to tell them that what they're thinking is not imaginary. It's actually taking place. You point out that, let's talk about this thing called duty. Is duty something in your DNA? Is it something you grow up with? Is it a sense that you're capable of putting the greater good ahead of all else?
Well, I think that it is a potential component of everybody's DNA. I mean, every single man and woman out there wearing a uniform, American military uniform, has a sense of duty. Every first responder, policeman, fireman, and others have a sense of duty. I think a lot, many teachers. So there are a lot of people out there, I think, who have a sense of duty. There are a lot of people in business and elsewhere who have a sense of duty to their communities, and they contribute in various ways. So,
but are they in our nation's capital?
Well, in our nation's capital, I think that particularly among the career people, both civilians and military, I think that there is a strong sense of duty. I think a lot of politicians come to Washington with a sense of duty, but in the course of staying there, and particularly if they stay there a long time, I think that they begin to confuse their own self-interest with the interests of the country, and they lose sight of their duty to the country.
Now, I wasn't going to ask you this, but we have this argument regularly around the radio studio here. You can probably tell we have a lot of opinionated people at this studio. And every time the midterm elections come around, or a presidential election, there's a huge contingency here that says vote out the incumbents. Very easy. We don't want career politicians because look what happens. It engenders gridlock. That's what happens. What would you say? Would you be in favor of that solution?
Well, I have always opposed term limits because once you get rid of members of Congress who have expertise, then the real influence and power goes to the lobbyists, the congressional staffers, and the permanent bureaucracy in Washington. The problem is, how do you balance that with people who become so preoccupied with saving their seat in Congress that they lose sight of what's in the public interest? I used to tell people we have term limits. They're called elections. But the truth is, because of gerrymandering and redistricting, the way it gets done, all but about, got 435 seats in the House of Representatives, all but about 50 or 60 of those, because of gerrymandering, are now completely safe for either a Republican or a Democrat. They almost run unopposed. And under those circumstances, then I think you begin to think, well, maybe we should have term limits. Some of the states, my own state of Washington, for example, has done something that I think helps mitigate that, and that is the open primary, where everybody runs and the top two vote getters are the ones who appear on the ballot in November. So you could have two Democrats or two Republicans or two independents or whatever, but it means that you have to reach beyond your party's most hardcore base, the most ideologically committed. You have to reach out to the center, and you have to reach out to people who may have different points of view if you want to come in first or second. That's a lot faster way to try and deal with this problem than to try and fix the redistricting problem.
So you're in favor of open primaries because you feel that will offer more choice.
I think it does. And I think it's a lot faster than trying to fix the redistricting problem, which could take decades.
Yeah, I agree it could. But, on the other hand, I argue that the problems that we face today are so much more complex that the idea that you send someone in with no experience really makes the country vulnerable. And, it's interesting. The same people who say vote out all the incumbents, I say, well, you did that when you elected President Obama. He wasn't the most experienced candidate, but there's an example of what happens, right? So I don't know. I'm on both sides of the fence here. I think you said it earlier. You've got to strike a balance. You want some senior members with experience, but are going to put the greater good ahead of private agendas. And on the other hand, you've got to have new people coming in as well with fresh ideas, and you don't want all career politicians. Now, we have to take our last break, and we'll be right back with Secretary Gates. You're listening to the Costa Report.
Did you know that every day we create 2.5 quintillion bytes of data, and that 90% of the data in the world today has been created in the last 2 years alone? This data comes from everywhere, and it affects everyone. This data is big data. Big data is all data, and it's more than simply a matter of size. Big data represents an opportunity to uncover new insights, make your business more agile, and answer questions that were previously beyond your reach. IBM's Big Data platform uses sophisticated technologies and patented advanced analytics designed to complement your existing information infrastructure. The IBM Big Data platform allows you to get started quickly today and expand to address more complex problems tomorrow. It doesn't matter where you start, it matters that you start. Find out how IBM can help you turn big data into a competitive advantage by visiting ibm.com/bigdata today.
The crisis in the Ukraine is the latest global conflict to pit the United States against Vladimir Putin's Russia. While the Cold War may have ended, U.S.-Russia diplomacy is here to stay. Understanding this volatile new era is not easy. For many years, experts have been trying to explain Russia's new leadership, but cracking the inner circle has remained elusive until now. The American Program Bureau represents some of the most knowledgeable and prominent Russian insiders who are available to speak to your organization. Experts such as Mikhail Gorbachev, former leader of the Soviet Union and master architect of modern-day Russia; Vladimir Posner, the dean of Russian journalism; Andrei Kozyrev, the first foreign minister under Boris Yeltsin; and Pavel Palashchenko, chief advisor for 25 years to Gorbachev, are available to speak at your next event. No Speakers Bureau offers greater insights into how Russia impacts our economy, our world, and our lives. To schedule these esteemed leaders for your next event, contact the American Program Bureau at 800-225-4575 or apbspeakers.com.
The Redwood Mountain Fair is coming May 31st and June 1st to Roaring Camp in Felton. This family-friendly event presents 22 bands featuring Lucas Nelson and POTR, Hot Buttered Rum, Pimps of Joy Time, Roy Rogers and the Delta Rhythm Kings, Sherry Austin with Hen House, Flor de Cagna, John Craigie, the Chop Tops, and more. Enjoy a weekend of music, local food, wine, microbreweries, arts and crafts, and a kids area. Proceeds from the fair benefit local nonprofit organizations. Tickets and info at redwoodmountainfair.com.
Hello? Hi, Grandma. No, Grandma, I can't fix your computer. I'm sorry it's so slow, but I don't know what to do with it. You clicked on what? You better call User-Friendly Computing, because I can fix any PC, Mac, or laptop. They'll even come to your house and pick it up. But if you bring it to the shop, they'll give you a free $50 diagnostic just for saying you heard their ad on KSCO. No, Grandma, downloading that free internet software won't save you time or money. Let's face it, most of your computer problems these days start with the user being tricked into clicking on a link that contains a path to computer hell. User-Friendly Computing will have you back on track fast. User-Friendly Computing is locally owned at 505 River Street across from Gateway Plaza. Or you can give them a call at 831-423-9653. That's 831 423-9653.
This is Sylvia Panetta. Join us for the final event of the Leon Panetta 2014 Lecture Series. On Monday, June 2nd, Secretary Panetta will focus on how presidents make decisions, leadership, crisis, politics, and trust, with David Axelrod, Erskine Bowles, Andrew Card, and Kenneth Duberstein. How does a president deal with crises in politics while maintaining the trust of the people? Join us Monday, June 2nd, 7 p.m., KSCO.
Welcome back to the Costa Report. I'm Rebecca Costa, and my guest today is Mr. Robert Gates. And I think you wanted to say something more about the midterm elections and how open primaries may be the fastest way to solve these redistricting issues.
I was just going to echo what you were saying, that I'm of two minds on this as well, because it is important to have members of Congress who have experience in these areas, and frankly, as a citizen, I want them to have that experience, because otherwise they can't effectively exercise their oversight role. So, I point to people like Senator Sam Nunn, Democrat of Georgia, who was chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee for many years and was a real expert. Frankly, California's Dianne Feinstein, I think, has been a very good chairman of the Senate Intelligence Oversight Committee. So having these more senior members who've been around and have some experience, I think, has great value. They're equal number on the Republican side. But particularly in the House, how you figure out to first of all, get past the partisanship created by the gerrymandering, and how you get past the careerism, which frankly applies to both houses, I think is a problem we have to figure out as a country.
Now, we've been talking about your book, Duty, Memoirs of a Secretary at War, and the importance of duty and trust and character. And one of the places we learn these things at a young age is from organizations like the Boys and Girls Club or the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. And I know you've been associated with the Boy Scouts since you were a child, and you now serve as a national president. And recently you came out saying that in addition to the Scouts having decided to include gay youths, you would have gone further and included gay scoutmasters. So it seems as though you're encouraging the Scouts to move toward a big tent philosophy, which is much more inclusive of our youth. Is that right?
Well, I think I can fairly say that I played an important role in opening both CIA and our military services to service by our gay citizens. And as I said in the speech, I applauded the decision by the Scouts to encourage gay youth to join the movement. The reality is, though, that our movement is deeply divided over whether to allow gay adults, and I have a very practical point of view. My personal view is, as you say, I would have gone further, but I now lead an organization that is comprised entirely of volunteers. 2/3 of our Scout troops are sponsored by churches, and to move further at this point would deeply divide and I think probably permanently fracture the Scouting movement. So my view is, at least during the time I'm president, which is 2 years, we need to focus on regaining our unity, focusing on the program, and focusing on making Scouting as exciting and as attractive to boys and young men as we possibly can, as what I believe is the finest organization in the country for building character and leaders for tomorrow, in addition to being a lot of fun.
Well, you and I are certainly on the same page. I believe there's plenty of divisiveness and polarization, and I don't need to be taking up issues that continue to advance that. I think we need more unity, and I really do appreciate the position that you've taken with the Scouts. It seems these days enrollment in the Scouts and other youth organizations, which help to develop these core values of duty, trust, honor, the enrollment is down. So to bring our conversation full circle, where do we get our ideas of duty and trust and responsibility? Where'd you get yours?
Well, I think they come, first of all, from the family. They come from an understanding from the family, from schools, from church and from organizations like the Boy Scouts and the Boys and Girls Clubs and other organizations that are reminders that we have obligations as citizens as well as rights as citizens, and those obligations involve duty. They involve giving something back to the community, the state, and the country that provides you with the freedoms that provides us with the freedoms we all have. So I think it comes from multiple parts. It's really part of the whole growing up process. And frankly, I would say one of the encouraging things, I now serve as the Chancellor of the College of William & Mary, and based on my experience as President of Texas A&M, I'm really encouraged by the magnitude of voluntarism that is going on in our colleges and universities across the country today. These young people are far more engaged in public service, in tutoring underprivileged kids, and volunteering for hospitals and doing a lot of things like that in the community that frankly did not happen when I was going to college nearly 50 years ago. So I take real heart from that these young people see the need to give back and that they do have a duty to their communities.
So as we look forward to the midterm elections, what characters should, what characteristics should we be looking for in our leaders? Because it sure seems like we could use a little education from you here.
Well, based on my experience, people need to have their own ideology and their own point of view on issues. But I think if I were to ask people to do one thing, it would be to ask people, are you prepared to go back to Washington and help make decisions that move the country forward? Are you willing to reach across the aisle and come up with solutions to problems rather than just sitting back there screaming at each other? I think that everybody should have a political point of view, and whether you're conservative or liberal or whatever. But the way I like to put it is that I've worked for 8 presidents, and I didn't know any that had a monopoly on revealed truth. And I think it's important for people that we elect to not be so self-centered that they think they have all the answers and that all the answers they have are the only right answers to solving our problems. So the question I would ask of candidates, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, are you prepared to go back there and work to help solve our problems, or are you just going to go back there and be part of the yelling?
Well said. I couldn't agree with you more. If they don't have the skills or tolerance to be able to listen to the other side and figure out where the common ground is, then you can't move forward, because gridlock and opposition is the same as paralysis. And so we need leaders that can talk, that can get along, and frankly, leaders with some business experience, because you can't get away with doing nothing in business. So that wouldn't hurt us very much either. Well, we are out of time, but before we say goodbye, I do want to take this opportunity to thank you for your book. It's an important book, and I hope our listeners will go out and get it. I promise you your neck will be hurting, shaking your head back and forth as you read it. And also, I want to thank you for your service to our nation. Thank you, Mr. Gates.
It's my pleasure, and thanks for inviting me.
It's been a pleasure, sir, and I hope you'll come back and see us again soon. If your station is leaving us after this hour and you have a question or a comment to make about our interview with Robert Gates, you can drop me a note on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and also at our website at RebeccaCosta.com on our contact page. And if you missed any part of today's interview, you can listen to the full program on Apple iTunes, Podbean, Voice America, and also the Costa Report website. Just click on the guest photograph and listen anytime from the convenience of your computer or mobile device. And while you're at our website, be sure to visit our new bookstore page, where you'll not only find Mr. Gates' book, Duty, for sale, you can also pick up a copy of The Watchman's Rattle, a book that shows how complexity and bureaucracy lead to gridlock, and also a mass confusion between facts and unproven beliefs, which also includes dogma and ideology. Over time, these unproven beliefs shape public policy, and policy becomes increasingly irrational, leading to the collapse of entire civilizations. This reoccurring pattern has been identified and chronicled in The Watchman's Rattle. So if you don't have a copy yet, Be sure to get one. And if you already have a copy, get one for a friend. Just as Gates opens our eyes to what goes on behind the scenes when our country goes to war, the Watchman's Rattle will open your eyes as to how and why great civilizations decline and eventually disband. So go to RebeccaCosta.com now and get your copy of the Watchman's Rattle. My guest next week is Congressman Tom McClintock, who faces an unusual challenge in the upcoming midterm election. He'll be with us to talk about immigration, pro-growth budgeting, and whether people should come before fish during periods of extreme drought. Don't miss a frank conversation with Congressman Tom McClintock next week, right here on the only news program that puts policy ahead of politics. Now stay tuned for a second hour of Straight Talk Radio. You're listening to the Costa Report.